Jeremy Clarkson spent 50 years mocking foreign lager, 40 years belittling farmers. Then he built a £75 million brewing empire by accident. Sounds like a joke. It isn't. Carlsberg tried to buy him out. He said no in 24 hours, because you can't buy this brand without the man who built it. This was never a celebrity cashing a cheque. This is the thing British brewing didn't ask for and can't ignore. Let's get into it. Every good story about Jeremy Clarkson begins with him standing in the middle of a disaster he's caused himself, looking faintly delighted about it. This one is no exception, and it's arguably the purest example of the pattern you'll find in his entire career. It's 2020. Diddley squat farm just outside Chipping Norton, deep in the kind of Cotswolds fold where the hedgerows still remember the war and the dry stone walls have never once been asked their opinion on anything. Least of all a man who's just bought 1,000 acres with television money. Clarkson has just brought in his first serious harvest of barley. 1,000 acres of the stuff or thereabouts, and there is, technically speaking, nowhere for it to go. The big maltsters weren't interested. Small batches, no track record, and a television presenter's name attached to the invoice. Not exactly what the grain trade was crying out for from a man they still considered. Not entirely unfairly given his history. A hobbyist with a camera crew trailing him round his own fields. The merchants who did bother quoting him offered prices that wouldn't have covered his diesel, let alone his time, his machinery, or the small fortune he'd already sunk into seed and fertiliser and hope. Caleb, ever the diplomat, ever the one left holding the practical consequences of somebody else's optimism, put it to him, plainly, and without much ceremony. They were going to lose money on every single ton they carted off the field, and there wasn't a clever way round it. Now, for most people, for any sensible person frankly, and Clarkson would be the first to admit he's rarely accused of being that, that's the point where you write it off, call it a tax loss, and go back to filming cars driving very fast in straight lines for a living. But Clarkson has spent half a century doing one thing rather well, and that's refusing to be told no by people he considers beneath his contempt, or at least beneath his patience. He'd been drinking bitter for 50 years, the proper stuff, the kind his father drank at the end of a working day without ceremony or explanation, the kind that was quietly vanishing from pub taps up and down the country, replaced by fizzy imports with names that sound like Scandinavian furniture, assembled with the wrong screws. Standing there, surrounded by grain that nobody in the industry particularly wanted, in a shed that smelled of diesel and damp straw and faint despair, he had the sort of idea that only ever makes sense in hindsight. He'd brew it himself and worry about the details afterwards. It sounds simple when you say it like that. It very much was not, and everyone involved knew it from the first conversation. He went sensibly enough, and it's worth noting Clarkson does occasionally do the sensible thing, usually by accident, to people who actually knew what they were doing. Rick and Emma King, who'd been running the Cotswold Brewing Company since 2002. 2 decades of proper brewing knowledge between them. Built the slow way, one unglamorous batch at a time, with none of the fanfare that would later attach itself to the whole operation. What they didn't have, until that point, was a 62-year-old with an Amazon Prime show quietly becoming the most watched original series on the platform, and an audience who'd have followed him into a burning building if he'd asked nicely enough and filmed the whole thing. Clarkson bought shares, partnered up properly, and in 2021, the 2 very different sets of expertise, decades of quiet brewing craft on one side, an audience that trusted him implicitly on the other, became a single operation with a single name and, for the first time, a genuine plan. They didn't call it something clever. No wordplay, no marketing department's fingerprints anywhere near it, no consultant in an office in London suggesting something punchier. They called it Hawkstone, after a Neolithic standing stone near the farm. 4,000 years old, already ancient when Rome was still finding its feet, watching legions and Normans and plagues and punks come and go, without so much as raising an eyebrow at any of it. It's the sort of name that only makes sense once you understand this was never really about beer. Not entirely. It was about permanence, about something British that had simply been standing there the whole time, patient and unbothered by fashion, waiting for someone to notice it again and give it a purpose. And the timing, when the lager finally launched in October 2020, should by every conceivable law of business have been an outright catastrophe. Pubs closed, the entire trade on its knees, landlords wondering whether they'd ever open the doors again. Who, in their right mind, launches a premium beer in the middle of a pandemic, when the very places that traditionally sell it are shuttered and dark. But Clarkson had stumbled onto something the big breweries had entirely missed. People were at home, they had money they'd normally have spent on holidays abroad, and they were quietly desperate for a small luxury that felt like it meant something more than another supermarket lager picked up out of habit. Hawkstone sold out faster than they could physically brew it. Within 8 hours of that first proper launch, it was the #1 selling beer on Amazon in the entire country, outselling Bud, outselling Corona, outselling Stella. 3 brands with marketing budgets. Clarkson's fledgling operation couldn't have dreamed of matching on their best day. The team seriously discussed rationing bottles before Christmas that year, genuinely worried the whole first run might vanish before the shelves needed restocking. Here's the thing worth sitting with for a moment, because it's easy to miss amid the numbers and the headlines. That first year didn't happen purely because of a famous face on the label. It happened because the beer was actually good, full stop. Rick's 20 years of quiet, unglamorous craft did the heavy lifting long before Clarkson's name did anything at all beyond getting people to try the first bottle. Now here's where Hawkstone stops being merely a good story and starts being genuinely an important one. Every other celebrity drinks brand in this country follows the same tired script, and you could set your watch by it. Famous face, existing drinks conglomerate, does the actual work behind a curtain nobody's invited to look behind. Famous face turns up to launches, collects a cheque, and moves along to the next endorsement without a backward glance. It's licensing dressed up as entrepreneurship, and the industry has a whole well-worn playbook for managing it. Buy the brand once it's big enough to matter, fold it quietly into the existing supply chain, and stop asking too many awkward questions about where the ingredients actually come from. Hawkstone refused, quite deliberately, to play along with any of it. The barley in every bottle is grown on diddly squat, and on neighbouring farms, a handful of miles from the brewery itself, close enough that you could walk the delivery route on a decent afternoon, not shipped in from wherever happens to be cheapest that particular quarter, grown in Oxfordshire, in Gloucestershire, by farmers who've worked that particular fold of England for generations, and who, for the first time in a long while, had a guaranteed buyer paying a fair, agreed price, rather than the cold and entirely indifferent mercy of the commodity markets. It costs considerably more to produce this way every single harvest. But that, rather pointedly, was the entire idea from the start, not an afterthought bolted on for the sake of good publicity, because this is a country that had quietly been told for decades that it simply couldn't make proper lager. Not really, not the kind worth boasting about. Lager was German business, Czech business, Danish business. Britain did warm ale and bitter and left the rest well alone. Thank you very much. The big breweries were rather fond of that particular myth, since it let them brew cheap industrial lager under continental-sounding names and charge premium prices for the privilege without much scrutiny. Clarkson looked at that accepted wisdom and did the thing he does best, arguably the only thing he does consistently well, ignored it completely. And it turned out British barley, malted and brewed properly by people who genuinely cared how the finished pint tasted, produced something clean, crisp, and confident enough to stand next to Peroni or Estrella without apologising for its postcode or its price tag. That was rather the point of pricing it as a premium beer from the very beginning, not competing with Carling on the bottom shelf for pennies, but standing shoulder to shoulder with the imports people reach for when they actually want something a little better than the usual. Now, no story about Clarkson would be remotely complete without a catastrophe entirely of his own making, and this particular one very nearly derailed the whole enterprise before it had properly found its feet. Summer of 2023, a batch of Hawkstone cider, made properly mined from actual cider apples grown in the Vale of Evesham and the Cotswolds, not eating apples dosed with sugar water and coloured up to look convincing on a shelf, began fermenting again after it had already been bottled, capped and shipped out to shops across the country. The pressure had nowhere left to go. Some bottles, quite literally, exploded on shop shelves and kitchen counters, in front rooms and picnic hampers, giving several unfortunate customers the fright of their lives over what was supposed to be a quiet drink. Most companies faced with that sort of thing would have said nothing publicly, quietly recalled the stock through official channels, and hoped nobody made too much of a fuss on social media. Clarkson went straight to social media himself, immediately, and told several 100,000 people that there'd been, in his own words, a massive mistake. and that if they had a bottle bearing a particular batch code, they should open it underwater, pour it away, and get in touch for a refund without delay. He apologised without hedging, without a single lawyer's fingerprint visible on the wording. He told them plainly that the rest of the stock was perfectly fine, and then, rather remarkably, in a way that would make most crisis communications consultants weep quietly into their coffee, sales actually went up in the weeks that followed, rather than collapsing as anyone in marketing would have predicted. Why? Because in an age of corporate statements drafted by 3 lawyers and a nervous PR consultant, all careful hedging and passive voice, here was a man simply telling the truth, in plain English, immediately, without softening it into meaninglessness. No, we take this extremely seriously. Nonsense trotted out for the cameras. Just, we messed up, here's exactly what to do about it. Sorry about that, genuinely. It turns out British consumers, given the honest choice between polished corporate silence and a straightforward admission delivered with a straight face, will choose the honesty every single time and reward it handsomely with their continued custom. By 2025, Hawkstone had posted sales north of £21 million, very nearly tripling the year before, 134% annual growth by any measure you care to check against the industry average. The 23rd fastest growing private company in the entire country, brewery or otherwise, ahead of firms with considerably deeper pockets and considerably less barley on their boots. On the shelves at Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, Tesco, sitting there quite comfortably among brands that have been established for the better part of a century. Poured in over 2,000 pubs from one end of the country to the other, from quiet village locals to busy city centre chains. And at the World Beer Awards in 2025, the Hawkstone IPA didn't just turn up to make up the numbers on the night and collect a polite round of applause. It won gold for best beer in its category, praised specifically for its subtle fruit and malted grain, its smooth mouthfeel, its clean, gently bitter finish that lingers rather than shouts. You cannot buy that particular result with a famous face and a television contract. However large the audience, judges tasting blind have absolutely no idea whose barley went into the mash and couldn't care less whose name is on the label. Now, before we go any further, if you're the sort who appreciates a story where the underdog actually wins for once, properly, without cutting a single corner along the way, do me a favour and hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me whether you've tried a bottle yourself and what you made of it, and if you haven't already subscribed and rung that bell, now's rather the moment to do it. We've a fair bit more of this tale left, and you genuinely won't want to miss where it goes from here. Here is the detail that separates Hawkstone from every other celebrity drinks brand that's ever tried this particular trick, and it's the one that ought to make you sit up properly and pay attention. Carlsberg made an approach, reportedly a private offer, somewhere in the region of £50 million, to buy the brand outright and fold it neatly into their own existing distribution network. Clarkson turned it down within 24 hours, without by all accounts losing much sleep over the decision. Not because the money wasn't good, it was extremely good, by any reasonable measure, the sort of figure most business owners would need a week to even properly consider, but because you cannot buy Hawkstone without buying the entire model that makes it work in the first place. Strip out the local barley, the transparent supply chain, the actual farmers who now depend on that guaranteed price every single harvest to plan their year around, and what you're left holding is simply another lager with a famous name stamped on the can. Indistinguishable, in the end, from Carling wearing a slightly better jacket and hoping nobody looks too closely. The business model isn't a clever marketing angle bolted on afterwards for the sake of a good story. It is the brand, in its entirety, root and branch. You cannot separate the two without destroying the very thing you just paid £50 million for. The brewery now employs 53 people, the overwhelming majority of them local, drawn from villages that had watched younger generations drift off toward Oxford and London for want of anything better to stay for. It's expanded 3 times in 4 years, each time faster than the last. Its valuation has climbed past £75 million, entirely separate from the farm's own valuation, which sits somewhere around £45 million in its own right. 2 distinct businesses, each quietly feeding the other in a way that's rather difficult to unpick. The farm grows the barley, the brewery turns it into something genuinely worth drinking. The television show, whether Clarkson fully intends it as advertising or simply can't help himself, given the cameras are rolling anyway, sends the whole enterprise straight into millions of living rooms every single year. Entirely free of charge, better than any advertising budget could buy. And the farm shop, mud-splattered car park and all, sells the lot to anyone prepared to queue for the privilege. There was even an advertising campaign, farmers singing a rather enthusiastic and thoroughly unambiguous endorsement of the product's quality, that got itself formally banned by the Advertising Standards Authority for its trouble. Within days, over 1 million people had gone looking for it online purely to see what all the fuss was supposedly about, which is rather more attention than the advert would ever have earned by being quietly approved. One does rather suspect Clarkson understood precisely what he was doing when he signed off on it in the first place. So let's return to where we started. The man who spent 50 years calling everything foreign and gassy inferior to a proper British pint has built, almost entirely by refusing to accept no from an industry that dismissed him not once, but twice, a genuine £75 million brewing empire. Not a licensing deal signed over lunch in an afternoon. Not a celebrity cash grab with someone else quietly doing the actual work behind a curtain while he collects the applause. A real operation, with real farmers finally getting a fair price for grain that used to go begging round the merchants every harvest. Real brewers applying real craft honed over decades, and real jobs in a corner of England that badly needed them and wasn't getting them from anywhere else. Talk to Clarkson about the money, and he tends to change the subject rather quickly, toward the barley farmers who finally have someone reliable to sell to year after year, regardless of what the weather or the war in Ukraine or the commodity markets happen to be doing that particular season. Toward the 53 people drawing a steady wage from the brewery floor. Toward the pubs that have found something worth putting on the bar that isn't simply one of the same 4 industrial lagers everyone else stocks without a second thought. The business is real. The profit is entirely real. But it was always, if you look closely enough past the headlines, a means to a rather more old-fashioned end. Keeping British farming viable when subsidies dry up and the government's attention drifts elsewhere. Keeping a rural community in Oxfordshire employed and functioning rather than slowly hollowed out. And proving, rather inconveniently for a great many marketing departments who'd assumed otherwise, that you can build something thoroughly modern on values that are anything but fashionable. He's shown that British consumers will happily pay more for something honest, so long as you're straight with them about why it costs what it costs. He's shown that a celebrity name doesn't have to mean a hollow product wheeled out for a photo opportunity and forgotten within a year. He's turned a shed full of barley that nobody wanted into one of the more remarkable business stories in modern British brewing. And he's done it while being, by his own cheerful admission, entirely unqualified to do any of it when he started, learning most of it as he went along in front of a camera. Love him or loathe him, and this country remains stubbornly, almost constitutionally divided on that particular question. It's rather hard to argue with the barley still growing in the ground, the 53 wages still being paid every single month, and the £50 million he turned down purely on principle when a lesser man would have signed on the spot. And there you have it, the story of how a man once famous chiefly for saying rude things about diesel engines quietly became one of the more important figures in British farming and brewing alike, almost entirely by accident, and almost entirely against the odds stacked against him from the very first bad harvest and the very first merchant who turned him away. If you've enjoyed spending this time with us in the Cotswolds, do stay a while longer. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell me down in the comments which part of this surprised you most. Was it the exploding cider? The £50 million offer he waved away without so much as blinking? Or simply the fact that the beer is, against all reasonable expectation, actually rather good in its own right? Either way, thank you for being here with us today. There's another story waiting for you just over on the next video, and I rather think you'll want to see exactly where that one leads to. Until then, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.